Hello, this is Terrence McNally. As we begin the new year, declaring resolutions and setting goals, you'll hear my 2012 conversation with Charles Duhigg about the ideas in his book, The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business. We also talk about his 2012 New York Times investigative series regarding Apple's labor practices. Hello, I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to Pacifica Radio and Free Forum. Welcome especially to those of you who have made listening to this show, whether live or in podcast, a habit. For that is the topic of the day. What is a habit? Are habits positive, a sign of cultivation and industry, or negative, a sign of weakness and mindlessness? Or are they neutral and their value up to us? Well, what have wise ones before us said? Aristotle. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Samuel Johnson. The chains of habit are too weak to be felt until they are too strong to be broken. Stephen Covey, who built an empire based on his book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, wrote, "Our character is basically a composite of our habits." And finally, no list of quotes is complete without Mark Twain. Nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits. Today's guest, Charles Duhigg, an award-winning investigative reporter for the New York Times, in a somewhat surprising career turn, has written the best-selling The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business. He tells us that at its most basic level, a habit is a simple neurological loop, a cue, my mouth feels gross, a routine, I ought to brush my teeth, and a reward, minty fresh. Backing out of the driveway, replying to emails, choosing what to munch on in the afternoon, running before work. Many of our most basic daily actions are not, in fact, the products of well-considered decision-making, but outgrowths of habits we often don't even realize exist. So we're going to talk about what a habit is, how they're formed, how they can be broken, and how we can put what we've learned about habits into practice so that we are at least somewhat their masters rather than their slaves. On Free Forum, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, media, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Charles Duhigg, a graduate of Yale College and Harvard Business School, as I said, is an investigative reporter for the New York Times, where he has most recently been the lead writer for its front page series on Apple. He's a winner of the National Academies of Sciences, National Journalism, and George Polk Awards, was part of a team of finalists for the 2009 Pulitzer Prize. He's a frequent contributor to This American Life, NPR, PBS's NewsHour and Frontline, and The Power of Habit is his first book. Welcome, Charles Duhigg, to Pacifica and Free Forum.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
I'd like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. And can you briefly tell us about your path to the work that you do today? Not so much this particular book on habit, but your work as an investigative reporter. We'll get to the book soon enough. Feel free to mention mentors, turning points, moments of decision.
Sure. You know, when I was I went to Yale as an undergraduate, as you mentioned, and worked on the college newspaper there. And after leaving Yale and living in the Middle East for a little while, decided to start a company in New Mexico where I had grown up. And I started that company, which we ended up selling. And while in the process of that, decided to go to business school. And while in business school, was trying to decide whether to go into journalism or stay in business, and felt like journalism was particularly interesting and sort of offered me a real opportunity to do something different every day, which is somewhat different from business, where you learn how to do one thing very, very well and end up doing it over and over and over again. Journalism offered me the opportunity to do something different every single day. And so I decided to do it.
And how did you end up on This American Life?
Well, they've asked me to come on, I guess, twice now. The once was to talk to them about the Apple series that we were working on, because they had broadcast a show by a guy named Mike Daisy and then did a retraction.
Well, I was going to say, you actually say on your website that one of the reasons you became a journalist has to do with This American Life. So
Right. Yeah. When I was working the summer between my first and second year of business school, I was working at a private equity group, and so my job was basically to build financial models every day. And so what I would do is I would come in and I would open up my computer and start working on financial models, and I found it to be it's the type of thing where you can listen to the radio while you're doing it. And so I would put on This American Life and found it sort of would limit myself to one or two This American Lives a day. But it was the best part of my day was listening to the show. And so that was one of the things that persuaded me to become a journalist, was this opportunity to kind of listen to this program and I felt like it was just much more interesting than anything else I was doing.
No, I find that really, really neat. I can just picture you doing this and and torn between what you're actually getting paid to do and what a company is depending on you to do and what's actually fascinating you.
Yeah, exactly. It was much more interesting to be listening to stories, and I found myself attracted to stories in a way that I wasn't when, the truth is that unfortunately finance, while it's fascinating, finance is kind of designed not to be so interesting on the day-to-day unless you're really, really into numbers. And I just found myself so much more attracted to stories and to the ambiguity inherent in stories. And so that's what I decided to do.
Yeah, and one thing I will say about The Power of Habit and your longer magazine articles that I've read is that you do certainly utilize story a good deal. Do you consider yourself a writer first or an investigator?
I think that they go hand in hand. I think to be a good writer, you have to have a really strong base of reporting, right? Particularly in nonfiction, the strength of your ability to create and tell a story really depends upon how much material you've collected in order to do so. And so I don't know that they kind of are separated as much for me as they are parts of the same continuum.
Well, I guess on the one hand, one could be a writer first and never do any research, be a novelist, you were drawn to both.
Yeah, I think that even for novelists, though, if you look at some of the best novels that are out there, I think that they really do reflect this kind of deep act of reportage, whether that reportage be sort of formal or informal, right? I think that even if you look at, like, say, Jonathan Franzen's work recently, which seems to be kind of, everyone sort of agrees is some of the preeminent sort of novels of our time.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you look at his work, the reason why it touches people so deeply is because he is reporting on contemporary life very, very closely. Right? He's writing about his experiences, even though it's novelized, with his parents and and from his parents' perspective, with their children, and talking about sort of how those things change. Or if you look at David Foster Wallace, even when David Foster Wallace, first of all, he was obviously a great journalist and produced a lot of nonfiction. But even if you look at his fiction, it's very, very closely reported, right?
I realize I really did speak too soon there, trying to set up the contrast that as soon as you started answering, I realized, of course, that's true. The foundation on from which a strong story comes is knowledge of reality. Whatever that may be.
I think that's right. Yeah. I think that's right. And I think that usually a reporter is doing something very similar to what a novelist is doing if they're doing their job right.
Mm-hmm. I'm Terrence McNally, and the voice you hear is New York Times investigative reporter Charles Duhigg. We're going to talk a lot today about his best-selling book, The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and in Business. And to learn more, you can go to charlesduhigg.com, and that's one word, Charles, Duhigg. This is Freeforum on KPFK 90.7 FM, 98.7 in Santa Barbara, streaming and podcasting at kpfk.org. You can visit me at terrencemcnally.net, TerrenceMcNally, terrencemcnally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website, and you can learn more there about the show, guests, podcasts, etc. You can listen to podcasts there at iTunes. You can sign up there at iTunes to have them delivered to you weekly. You can sign up there or by emailing me at temcnally, TEMCNALLY, at mac.com to get a weekly email telling you who's going to be on and what we're going to talk about and 2 or 3 articles of background. You can check out Freeforum with Terrence McNally on Facebook and follow me on Twitter at McNallyTerrence. Before we turn to habit and the new book, let's talk a bit about Apple. What did you originally set out to learn about Apple, and what did your series of articles reveal?
Well, the series is called the I Economy, and it started with this sort of basic question, which was, what's going on with the economy right now that we seem to be in still a prolonged slump, and most particularly that jobs have not recovered. And our original thought was to try and tell this through the story of smartphones, because it seems like everyone has a smartphone. Mobile computing seems like the technology of the future, and yet there's no smartphones that are made in the United States of America, despite the fact that most of the companies that make some of the most popular phones are based here.
And if I can cut in for a second, one of the things we hope for, Charles Duhigg, is that a new technology, a new hot product, is what allows the economy to keep being sort of reborn. And here's this new phenomenon that's become, ubiquitous, and it's not paying off.
Absolutely. And it is paying off for some people, right? It's just not creating a lot of jobs. I mean, if you look at historically kind of what has happened with the American economy, particularly when the American economy was focused on manufacturing, some new technology would come along, like the car or the semiconductor, and it would create thousands and tens of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of American jobs. And that was really, really important, because that's how the middle class essentially sustained itself, was by taking these jobs that new technologies and new industries would establish. But the problem is that when it comes to most technologies that come about today, they do create a lot of jobs, but not in the U.S. They tend to create many more jobs in Asia, in Europe, overseas, than they are in the United States. And we decided to focus a little bit on Apple because it seemed like a really interesting company, a lens through which to look at the national economy. Obviously, it's the most valuable company in the world right now. The iPhone is kind of the iconic symbol of technological advance. And yet what's interesting about Apple is that, for instance, General Motors and General Electric used to employ hundreds of thousands of Americans. Apple only has about 65,000 employees worldwide, and only about 45,000 of those work in the U.S., and about 30,000 of those are people who work in retail.
In the stores, those Apple stores, yeah.
Yeah, in the stores, right, which is essentially a step above minimum wage, but not much of a step above a minimum wage.
Right. You're in a cooler place, and it's kind of cool to have that T-shirt on, but you're not making a ton more money.
Exactly. But there are some people, obviously, who work for Apple who make a huge amount of money. And so we wanted to ask, if Apple is kind of the emblem of what a company wants to be, what does it mean that it's creating so few American jobs? And from there, we sort of started down a path that started to answer that question, but also helped us ask, so what else does Apple tell us about modern capitalism? We looked at, what conditions were like in Chinese factories where the iPhone is made. We looked at how Apple pays its taxes and avoids paying its taxes. In a sense, we could have written a number of these articles about any number of companies, but Apple became this lens to help explain what capitalism is like nowadays and why some of the problems that we're experiencing as a nation exist.
And I think, by the way, one of the things I would imagine is a helpful lens here is that while you're investigating this, Apple is phenomenally admired, identified with. It's not just successful; it's also, a badge sort of to many people of so many things that are good.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it seems like into every decade there's a company that comes to typify the ideal of what American capitalism wants to achieve. For a long time that was Ford or GM. And then it became General Electric at one point. For this decade, I think unquestionably, it's Apple.
Mm-hmm.
Apple embodies what every company wants to be. And so looking at its strengths as well as its weaknesses tells us a lot about how American capitalism works today.
Now, that famous exchange between Steve Jobs and Barack Obama, could you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, but there's been a couple of them, but the one that we highlight is that, a number of Silicon Valley luminaries had set up this dinner where Barack Obama came out after he was elected to president and sat down with him to basically talk about job creation, talk about what Silicon Valley and technology can be doing to create more jobs. And each of the people who were there, all the executives, were told to come with a question to ask the president. Kind of this was the prep that they got. And they go in, and they're going around the table and introducing themselves and asking their questions. And when he gets to Steve Jobs, the president actually interrupts him and says, "Look, I've got a question for you. What would it take to build iPhones in the United States of America?" And what Steve Jobs says is, those jobs aren't coming back. That those jobs, a lot of them were never here in the first place, but that the U.S. lacks mid-level engineers, that we can't compete with China on flexibility. What he didn't say is that Chinese workers and Asian workers are so much cheaper, because it turns out that's not a big part of the reason why Apple is in China. Labor is a very, very small component of making smartphones or other gadgets. It's just the real costs are, for instance, making semiconductors or getting the glass that's on the face of the iPhone, etc. Those components are the expensive part. And what's happened is that a lot of those components are now made in China because that's where the supply chains are. And since the supply chains exist there, it makes sense to build there in addition. And you need a whole bunch of mid-level engineers to oversee this complicated manufacturing. And the U.S. doesn't produce tool makers anymore. We don't produce mid-level engineers at the numbers that they're needed. And according to Mr. Jobs, and this is true, I think, throughout the sentiment is true throughout the technology industry, American workers aren't willing to make the sacrifices to achieve this extreme productivity and flexibility that Chinese employees are.
Yeah, that's what I find interesting. As you say, it's not the wage per hour that's the significant thing. It's the willingness to turn on a dime, to work endless hours, and the other thing that I think people, if they think about it, may go, "Oh, that makes sense," but it was surprising to me was that so much of this work is handwork. Is people sitting there? So it's not a question even of those workers. It's not even a question of education or technical skills so much as it is this flexibility. So talk a bit about that.
Well, there's this need for extreme flexibility because the production cycles are so fast, right? Very often, take for instance the iPhone. Before the iPhone came out, just 6 weeks before it came out, Steve Jobs ordered a complete redesign of the materials that were used for the casing. The iPhone originally had a plastic screen, and Steve Jobs said he wanted a glass screen 6 weeks before it was supposed to be on shelves. It took about 4.5 weeks to figure out how to do that. And so Apple had a very limited amount of time to actually train all of its employees, all of its workers, to use glass instead of plastic. So what they were able to do in China is, for instance, wake up thousands of people at midnight and have them on the production line within 20 or 30 minutes so they can start turning out these products. It'd be very hard to convince American workers to, rouse themselves out of dorms. In China, it's very common that when people work in factories that they sleep in dorms on the property of the factory so that you can go and wake them up at midnight and get them on the line. People are willing to move from city to city much more easily than they are in the United States. And having that flexible workforce is very important to a company like Apple because it's releasing a new product a year. They're oftentimes making changes and then implementing them within hours on a production line. It's hard to do that when you're dealing with millions and millions of products or millions and millions of individual smartphones.
Yeah, so some of the things we like about Apple, that wonderful design, that intuitive feel, that ability to improve so much is dependent at that end on this kind of labor. You say factories can hire 3,000 people overnight or create facilities that house 250,000 workers and change them in a couple of hours or a couple of days from one product to another.
That's exactly right. Right. And when you think about it, that's what's needed in order to have a brand new iPhone every single year.
Yeah.
If you compare, for instance, iPhones to, say, cars, back during the heyday of Detroit, there was a major redesign in automotive style maybe once every 5 years. Redesigning cars was a big, big deal. Now we've become accustomed to having a pretty major redesign of the technology we use every single year. But the only way that that can happen is if you have extreme flexibility in your manufacturing. And that takes countries like Asian nations where workers are willing to be that flexible.
Okay, I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with New York Times reporter Charles Duhigg. The focus of much of our conversation today will be about his new best-selling book, The Power of Habit. But right now we're talking about his series of articles about Apple. So what does this say then? So we've got what the sort of the problem is. And what is – but Foxconn, the largest manufacturing company over there, is – I mean, I know one just particular incident or fact about it was they had people actually committing suicide at some of these enormous factories, and their intervention was to put nets up so that they could jump off the roof but not die. This is that's maybe at the far end of the continuum, but where does Apple, in its relationships to Foxconn and in our relationship to admiring Apple, how does all of that fit together?
Well, so as you point out, Foxconn is the largest private employer in China, and they're also one of the largest manufacturer of electronics goods in the world. And every company, Apple, Dell, Microsoft, HP, everybody works with Foxconn. When we were writing about Foxconn earlier this year, and for a number of years, they've come under criticism because I think a lot of people heard about the suicides, and they did take steps beyond the nets. But I think that the bigger issue was that work conditions within Foxconn plants have been categorized as being fairly harsh. People were oftentimes asked or coerced into working long overtime shifts in excess of 60 hours per week, and oftentimes 7 days a week. The dorms that people live in, we've been told, are not very nice. Sometimes they stuff 12 to 15 people inside a room. There's been riots inside the dorms because of disputes over pay. And in some cases, people stand for very prolonged periods of time when they're working. So work conditions are harsh. And in addition, within some factories that have produced Apple products and products for other companies, there's also been some things that move from harsh to dangerous. There's been incidents of explosions where people have been killed, exposures to toxic chemicals that have caused nerve damage among workers. And I think, I don't think this probably shocks many of your readers that conditions in China within factories are worse than they are within the United States. But what is somewhat shocking is that those factories are where a lot of the devices that you carry in your pockets are produced. Right? There's a direct line from factories where accidents have killed people to the iPhone that you carry in your pocket or the computer that's on your desk. Now, Apple has, particularly since our series came out, Apple has taken these issues very, very seriously. After we published sort of a long article about how dangerous it is in some factories and the fact that there's been warnings of workers being exposed to dangers making iPhones and other devices, that those warnings weren't sufficiently acted upon, according to some activists. Apple has taken very proactive steps. They've invited in some independent auditors. Foxconn, the company that manufactures all of this stuff and that owns the factories, announced after our series came out that they were going to be increasing wages for 1.2 million workers within China, and that they would be cutting hours significantly and not economically penalizing people for cutting those hours. So if you earned a certain salary, your hours would go down, but you would earn the same salary. So I think that you can argue that everyone within this industry takes the issue seriously and has been very active on it. I think the question is that there is a tension here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Apple wants to keep costs down. They're very aggressive about how they negotiate with their suppliers, and they drive down prices. And that means that suppliers often cut corners or have an incentive to cut corners when it comes to working conditions. In addition, consumers want a new device all the time, and they want it as cheap as possible, right? People want their new iPhone every single year, and they don't want to pay more than a couple $100s for it. And that means that you get into situations where workplaces can become dangerous, because the only way that you can do things that quickly and that inexpensively is to sometimes expose workers to situations where there are dangers.
Yeah, you wrote about that tension. You said Apple, there's a conflict within Apple, which is that when enforcing those rules, when getting really, really tough with suppliers, conflicts with creating the best products possible, turning out those products as fast as possible, maintaining relationships with very important suppliers like Foxconn, the discipline around that, the dedication breaks down. And you're not pointing to a specific instance or something. You're just saying that's kind of the way it is.
That's what we've been told by Apple insiders, is that there is this basic tension that look, no company wants to hurt people on purpose, and Apple has for years talked about how they take safety very, very seriously overseas. And so the question is, why is there this conflict? Why do these incidents still occur? And what people tell us is it's because of this competing pressures.
All right. Look, finally, I realize I had a question here, which I think we answered earlier, but I'll just set it up here, but I think we did. Apple, if not the wealthiest corporation in the world, very nearly so, sitting on enormous cash, recently decided to issue dividends. And what would it take for them to change things in a more meaningful way? Or is it not a matter of profits, but simply that their model doesn't allow a different method or location of manufacturing? And I think
I think it's a really good question, right? And in fact we just had a piece last Sunday that kind of tried to answer that, which is what would it take to build the advanced components within an iPhone inside the United States? The answer is that it would be a little bit more expensive. Not hugely more expensive, but a little bit more expensive. So Apple's profits would go down. And in addition, it would also take longer, right? Because we would need to build the supply chains here that China already has. What's interesting is that one country has already done this, Brazil. So iPhones are being manufactured in Brazil right now because Brazil has these huge tariffs that if you import electronics, they're much more expensive. And so Foxconn essentially decided to open up plants in Brazil so that they could manufacture iPhones and iPads domestically. And I think that obviously creates Brazilian jobs. There's a downside to it, though, which is that products in Brazil are much more expensive, including even the iPhones and iPads that are made within Brazil. You're not sending work to the lowest cost place, and so as a result, consumers end up having to pay more for those products.
Mm-hmm. So for Apple, it's this price pressure. Now, what we know, though, is, as I said, they're sitting on an enormous amount of cash. They're giving dividends at this point, and I mean, this isn't. You're not sitting on their board. Could they take the hit of if instead of pricing the iPhone so that it was more expensive than all of its competition, or more expensive, that they took the hit in profits and they took the hit in dividends and so on? Is there even the room for that?
Yeah, absolutely. If Apple decided that they wanted to manufacture the iPhone in the United States and most of its components here, then they could absolutely do that. But the question is, who would reward them for that? Right? Consumers don't say, I want to buy made in the USA when I buy my smartphone.
No.
So if Apple's products all of a sudden become more expensive, it's not like consumers are going to pat them on the back. They're going to complain.
Yeah.
And not only that, but the government won't give it. There's not a lot of tax benefits to building in the U.S. right now as opposed to building overseas. In fact, there's some tax advantages to going overseas.
Right.
And so yes, absolutely, Apple could manufacture the iPhone in the United States. The question is, what incentives are there for them to actually do that? And not many.
Very good. I think that's where we'll leave the question. I really appreciate this. Oh, let me ask you one last thing on Apple, which is, I don't think I'm not sure you covered it, but the recent thing where they dropped out of the environmental certification of electronic products, and then big reaction, they jumped back in. People probably heard about that. Can you briefly tell people what happened?
Yeah, I didn't really write on it or report on it, and so I'd rather not sort of describe it because I usually limit myself to.
Fair enough. Okay, so we will leave Apple there. But that question you finally asked is what you finally said is, where are the incentives? And so then it becomes not just about Apple, but about the government, about the consumers, about the system in which Apple operates. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with the New York Times investigative reporter Charles Duhigg. We are now going to shift to talking about his best-selling book, The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business. And to learn more, you can go to charlesduhigg.com. We're near the halfway mark. This is Freeform on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 in Santa Barbara, streaming and podcasting at kpfk.org. This is Terrence McNally. Happy New Year. You're listening to my 2012 conversation with Charles Duhigg about the ideas in his book, The Power of Habit. How did the book, The Power of Habit, happen? Was I correct that this is your first book?
That's right. It's my first book.
So something really grabbed you.
Yeah, it started about 9 years ago when I was in Iraq as a reporter, and I met this army major down in a city named Kufa, which is about an hour south of Baghdad. And he had been given the job of trying to stop the riots within the country. And so one of the things he did is he went to the mayor of Kufa and he asked him to remove the food vendors from all of the plazas. And the mayor, who's dealing with like suicide bombers and stuff like that, says, "Sure, no problem." So a couple of weeks later, a crowd starts growing in one of the plazas, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And one of the things that you can't tell from television is that it oftentimes takes hours for riots to develop. Right, the crowd grows over time until someone kind of throws a bottle, and then all hell breaks loose. And so the crowd was getting bigger and bigger and bigger over time, and some of the local Iraqi cops radioed the base and said, be on standby because it looks like a riot's going to break out. And it got to about 5:30 or 5:45, and the outermost ring of sort of spectators start getting hungry, and they start looking around for the kebab sellers that usually fill the plaza, and none of them are there because they've been removed by the mayor. So they go home. And then the sort of next ring of people sort of see these people leaving and think to themselves, oh, well, there must be another riot someplace else that's better. I'm going to follow them and see where they're going. And the crowd just kind of peters out. And this happened again and again and again. In fact, over the 9 months that the Army Major was there wasn't one riot. And he said it was because he had removed these food vendors. And so I asked him, how did you know that removing the food vendors would have this impact and stop these riots? What he said was, first of all, he had tried a whole bunch of other stuff. But he said when he joined the military, he realized that the military is all about teaching people to recognize habits and to change them. Right? Our natural instinct is someone shooting at us to run away. But the military teaches you this habit to shoot back. And it even teaches you kind of mundane habits like, how to communicate with your spouse so that if you're in a war zone and you're emailing with your spouse, you're not going to get so distracted because you're fighting with each other, or how to manage your money, the sort of spending habits so that it's not weighing down on you when you're out doing missions. The military is kind of this giant machine for changing habits. And the major told me that once you start to see people's behaviors as collections of habits, once you recognize that a crowd of 100 Iraqis is actually a bunch of habits kind of working in tandem, it's like someone gives you this magical visor and lets you suddenly understand how everything works, and you can start to influence and change people's behaviors. And so I thought that was really interesting. So when I got back to the U.S., I started researching what we'd learned about habits and discovered that in the last decade, we've actually learned a tremendous amount about how habits work.
Okay, so this is one of those things that's obviously, as I cited, Aristotle, and Samuel Johnson and so on at the top. Habit is something we've known and cared about for a long time. But there have been advances recently, as in so many fields that have to do with the brain and the mind and human behavior. Let me, if I may, William James is often cited when we talk about habit. As you write, he devoted a whole chapter of his 1890 Principles of Psychology to it. And so when I first thought about habit, I thought, what does James say about it? So let me actually just do this very quickly, Charles, but I'm going to read a couple of quotes from James and tell me if the science that we've learned actually backs him up. Okay? So he says 99 hundredths, or possibly 999 thousandths of our activity is purely automatic and habitual, from our rising in the morning to our lying down each night. It's not quite that high, is it? But tell us what science knows.
Yeah, well, so about half of what we do every day is habit. There was a study that was done by a Duke University professor a couple of years ago, and what she found was that 40 to 45% of our daily actions are not actually decisions, but are in fact habits. that almost unfold automatically or subconsciously. So he's a little off on the percentage, but he's right in theory that basically habits shapes a huge amount of our behavior.
Okay, he says new habits can be launched. Yes or no?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, you can change one of the things that we've definitely learned in the last decade is that it doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter how ingrained a behavior is, you can change any habit if you know how to diagnose it.
And we're gonna go into that in a little more detail. Let me give you two more of James's quotes, though, because I always find this interesting that what these guys did, kind of based on their observations without the advanced science, and now we have these, brain scans and things. In the acquisition of a new habit or the leaving off of an old one, we must take care to launch ourselves with as strong and decided an initiative as possible.
Wait, I'm sorry, read that one more time.
He says,
I guess I'm not...
in the acquisition of a new habit or leaving off an old one, we must take care to launch ourselves with as strong and decided an initiative as possible. So there's got to be some major decision, some major initiative to change that inertia.
Well, I think in a sense that's true. I mean, one of the things that we've learned is that in order for a habit to really change, you have to essentially make it a priority and believe that change is possible. So let's take Alcoholics Anonymous as an example. There's a really interesting AA basically works by changing people's habits. When most people have when a lot of people say that they're alcoholics, what they really mean is that they have habit dysfunctions around alcohol consumption. And so AA works for a lot of people, but the question has always been, why does it seem to fail after working for so long, right? People will go sober, they'll spend years sober, and then all of a sudden some major crisis will happen. They'll get divorced, or their parent gets sick, or they get sick, and they go back to drinking. And the question was, why at those moments of stresses do these new habits seem to break down? And the answer seems to be because at a moment of stress, if you don't sufficiently believe that the change is permanent, then people tend to relapse. So we know that people who make it through those moments of crisis without relapsing are ones who for some reason have a belief that they can make it through this without having to return to alcohol. And one of the strongest ways to create that relief or that belief is to change in the company of a group. That this is why groups are so powerful, is because they help us create a sense of belief that change is actually possible. That's why AA, for instance, focuses so much on going to meetings and meeting with sponsors. It's a social experience because social experiences are how belief is best created.
Very good. Let's go back to the elementary elements, if you will, that I mentioned in the introduction of what is a habit. And you write very well about this, that it's a loop.
That's right. So there's three. So what we've learned in the last decade, because of experiments in neurology, is that every habit has three components. There's a cue, which is like a trigger for the automatic behavior to start in the first place. And then there's the automatic behavior itself. And then finally, a reward. And the reward is how your brain learns to remember this pattern for the future. In fact, a particular part of your brain, the basal ganglia, is where habits seem to spawn out of. And for years, people have focused on the behavior, right? That's kind of where our attention was drawn. But what we've learned through experiments over the last couple of years is that it's by focusing on the cue and the reward that we gain the most influence over changing habits and creating new habits. It's this trigger and the reward that really shape why our automatic behaviors occur.
Okay, and that seems to me to be, as you say, that's a huge shift. And as you say, if you focus, since what we've learned is that the cue and the reward have sort of, if you will, the leverage, that I think it would be natural that we would have been preoccupied with the habit, the routine, the behavior. This is so. Tell your own cookie story.
Well, yeah. So I mean, this is kind of a great example of how to think about these cues and rewards. Is that when I started working on this book, I had this terrible habit of I would go and I would eat a cookie every afternoon, and it was like, it was, to be honest, it was kind of like I felt kind of ashamed of it because it was. I think I'm a smart person and I'm successful in a lot of ways. And I would actually I put a note on my monitor one day saying no more cookies to remind myself. But, every afternoon I'd get to this place and I'd almost kind of without thinking about it, just walk up to the cafeteria and eat a cookie. And I couldn't figure out why I felt so powerless over this, why I kept on doing it. And so I was talking to these neurologists and psychologists and psychiatrists and asking them all these questions about how habits work. And I would mention my cookie incident and say, I have this friend who has a cookie friend.
Of course.
Can you help me? And what they said is if you want to change this habit, what you need to do is you need to diagnose the cues and the rewards. So let's start with the cue. And they would say, whenever you get the urge to have a cookie, just write down a couple of different things, because all cues usually fall into one of 5 categories. They tell me to write down what time it was, where I was, what my emotion was, what I was thinking about, what other people were close by, and if I had just sort of done what I had just done, like what behavior I just engaged in. And what I noticed is that most of those would differ from day to day, but the time of day was always the same. It was always between 3:15 and 3:45 that this cookie urge would strike. And they said, that's your cue. Your cue is the time of day. So once I'd figured out the time of day, then I needed to figure out what the reward was. And I thought that the reward was the cookie, right?
Right, of course.
Good. And they said, oh, no, you don't understand. Rewards are very complicated. A cookie is like, 8 or 10 different rewards kind of all bundled into this one little gooey thing. And so for instance, was the reward that I was trying to satisfy hunger, in which case eating an apple should work just as well. Or was it that I was craving the energy that the sugar would give me, in which case having a cup of coffee should do the trick? Or that I just liked the sweet taste, sort of seeking that novelty of the taste sensation, in which case, drinking a diet soda or just taking some Splenda and sucking it off my finger, that should do the trick as well. So I experimented with it.
That's right. You tried these things, yeah.
Yeah, each day I'd try a different thing. Instead of getting a cookie, I'd try the coffee or the apple. One day I just went for a walk outside. Maybe it was just that I needed a break, and the cookie was providing a break. And what I eventually figured out by running these little experiments was, when I went up to the cafeteria to get my cookie, that's when I would see my colleagues, right? If you're an investigative reporter, you don't spend a lot of time talking to your colleagues. You're usually sort of typing or looking at documents or on the phone with sources. And so each day when I'd go to the cafeteria, that's when I got to see sort of friends and chat with them and just socialize. That's what I was actually craving, was the socialization. The cookie was just kind of a convenient excuse for it. And so once I figured that out, once I knew what the cue and the reward was, I was able to change the habit. And so each day now, at about 3:30, I stand up from my desk almost automatically, and I look around for someone to go gossip with. And I walk over to their desk, and I gossip for 10 or 15 minutes. And then I go back to my desk, and the cookie urge is totally gone. I've changed this habit. But the key was that I had to recognize what the cue and what the reward was and break it down into these components. And only then was I able to actually reshape it in a way that was healthier for me.
That's the voice of Charles Duhigg. We're talking about his best-selling book, The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business. And you can learn more at charlesduhigg.com. That's Duhigg. I asked you to tell it because it's so simple. We all have those. And you actually, I highly recommend the book, but even if one just goes to your website, you've got stuff up there on your website, the appendix that you've got up there, the flow chart that you've got up there. You've got this thing of identify the routine, experiment with rewards, isolate the cue, and if you do that, science and reality will reward you.
That's absolutely right. But what's interesting about it is that it's simple when I say it, right? Like I sort of just walk through it. But the truth of the matter is, I had been struggling with this cookie thing for years. Right? It wasn't so simple that it's only simple once someone draws your attention to it. And I guess that's the real importance of this science of habit formation, is that once someone explains how to identify cues and rewards, once you understand the importance of the triggers and the rewards and the cravings, it becomes easier to change your behaviors. But you really need someone to explain how habits work, to have a framework to understand them. Because the thing about a habit is, it's almost unconscious.
Mm-hmm,
right? You're not really paying attention to your behavior when a habit unfolds. And so as a result, it might be simple, but it can elude your vision very, very easily.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that was quite interesting that is dependent on the science is that you talk about it, the scientists examine rats in mazes pursuing chocolate and so on. And what they found was a lot of brain activity at the time of the cue, not much brain activity during the wandering through the maze, and a lot of brain activity at the moment of the reward. Now, that wasn't the first time, but as someone does something habitually, and I think that is what told them that the cue and the reward were what was crucial, right?
Exactly. When you're in the middle of a habit, so your brain kind of pays a lot of attention to the cues, and it kind of shakes itself awake when you find the reward. But in the middle of the habit, it's almost as if your brain goes to sleep, or that you start thinking about something else. You go on autopilot, and for instance, when you're backing your car out of the driveway, you go on autopilot. You're able to, think about turning on the radio, or whether you left your kids' lunch inside, or the meeting you have later that day, or you're driving to work by habit, and you remember getting in the car, and you remember showing up at work, but you can't remember anything in the middle. Your brain essentially has this amazing ability to go to sleep during a habit.
That's one of the reasons that we have them, isn't it?
That's exactly right, because otherwise we would never have the mental capacity to invent fire and spheres and video games and aircraft carriers. It's very, very efficient for our brain to program some activities and then kind of turn itself off. But that's the downside of habits, too. That's why we feel so powerless against them, is because our brain is literally disengaged.
Yeah.
You have to somehow figure out how to make yourself wake back up.
Right,
and that's
right.
why understanding the habit is so powerful.
Yeah, and the thing, if anyone wants to think about that, think about when the first time you backed out of a driveway.
Oh, right.
Your brain was on hyperdrive with every minute decision you were making. And then my stepson learned to drive this past year. And it was so clear in what his experience, that over a short period of time, it becomes automatic. And as you say, that's what also makes it invisible.
Right. Absolutely. Or think about when you're driving to work and all of a sudden the guy in front of you brakes all of a sudden, right? And it's like you're kind of disengaged, and then all of a sudden you're there, you're very present, you're there. It's because all those cues that you're accustomed to, they suddenly fade away, and there's some new stimulus that makes you wake up again.
Yeah.
That's how you change habits. Is you pay attention to those stimuli, those cues, and those rewards.
One other piece, and then I do want to talk about habits in business, or the targeting, if you will, of habits in business. What are keystone habits?
Keystone habits. Well, there's this really interesting thing that researchers have found, which is that some habits seem to matter more than others. They set off when some habits change. They seem to set off this chain reaction that changes all these other habits. And those are known as keystone habits. So a great example of this is exercise. When people start exercising habitually, they start eating differently too, almost without even noticing it. But that makes sense, right? You're exercising, you feel good about your body, you feel good about yourself, you sort of stop eating hamburgers and start eating salad. But what's interesting is that when people start habitually exercising, they also start using, on average, their credit cards less frequently. They begin doing their dishes earlier in the day. They oftentimes are about 38 minutes more productive at work per day.
Wow.
And that's more surprising, right? Because there's nothing about going running in the morning on a regular basis that would somehow suggest that you would pull out your credit card less often. But for a lot of people, exercise habits are keystone habits. They start setting off this chain reaction in people's lives, and it changes all these other patterns. And researchers who've looked into this, the reason why they think this happens is that on a subconscious level, there's some habits that when we start to change those habits or create new habits, it starts to change our self-image.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
Yeah. So someone who can exercise every morning starts thinking about themselves as the type of person who exercises every day effortlessly. And that's the type of person who has willpower. That's the type of person who has control over their spending habits. And so even without even realizing it, they begin adjusting the patterns in their life to accommodate this new self-image.
Mm-hmm. And would that be something that probably AA had going for it as well, that alcohol was so ruinous that if they handled that one, they began to Because I do hear about, people handle that one and then other things change.
Absolutely. I think for a lot of people, there's good keystone habits and there's bad keystone habits. For a lot of people, I think sobriety is a really important positive keystone habit. And simultaneously, I think for a lot of people, when they start drinking too much, their self-image changes in a way that they also start doing other things. Even if they haven't been drinking recently, their temper is less under control. They spend more carelessly. The keystone habits matter a lot because they shape how we see ourselves. And how we see ourselves has all these impacts, subconscious impacts, on the decisions we make every day.
And which goes back to some of the things we said earlier about belief and will and those sorts of things. If you think you are someone who has the strength to do things, that has a great deal to do with whether you actually will or not.
Absolutely.
One last question on keystone habits. Exercise is one that seems to work for a lot of people. Do we know what they are, or are they different for different people?
They're different for different people, and they're different in different settings.
Different cultures, probably even.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for instance, in the United States, for a lot of families, eating dinner together is a keystone habit. We know that if families eat dinner together, that kids end up doing better in school and they start their homework earlier, et cetera. That's not necessarily true in other countries. In other countries, eating breakfast together seems to have much more of a profound impact than eating dinner together. And I think a lot of that just has to do with how different cultures sort of pace out the day.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's different for different people in different settings, but there are ways to figure out what the keystone habits are in your life. It's also, keystone habits also exist within companies. You mentioned companies earlier.
Right, Alcoa.
One of the things, Alcoa is a great example of this. So if people are familiar with Alcoa, it's one of the largest aluminum companies on earth. And Paul O'Neill, before he became Treasury Secretary, was the CEO of Alcoa. And when he came in as CEO, and Alcoa was in a sort of bad place at that point, Paul O'Neill said that rather than focusing on efficiency and productivity and profitability, he was going to focus on worker safety habits. Because he knew that for Alcoa, worker safety was a keystone habit. And he was exactly right. Once he started changing habits around worker safety, the company began to transform. And within just a couple of years, it was one of the most profitable companies in the United States.
Mm-hmm. That's the voice of Charles Duhigg. We're talking about his book, The Power of Habit. We got about 5.5 minutes left, so I'm just going to say, in there you have a great story about Procter & Gamble and one of their products and what they learned, and Pepsodent, one of the early companies that basically made brushing your teeth twice a day a habit that did not exist before that. People get the book, read those articles, but let's talk about Target.
Okay.
Because that, and if I say you've got about 5 minutes that we're going to talk about Target, take off.
So Target's a really, really interesting company. It's a very smart company. And one of the things that they do is they study consumers' habits very, very closely. In fact, they study consumers' habits so closely that they're able to tell when a shopper, in many cases, is pregnant, even if she has not told the store that she's pregnant. Because we know that from studies that when women are pregnant, their shopping habits change in kind of predictable ways. Now, some of it is pretty obvious, right? As they get close to the delivery date, they buy things like diapers or a crib. But some of it's actually pretty nuanced. For instance, at the beginning of a second semester, many pregnant women will start all of a sudden not shifting from scented lotion to unscented lotion. And as they move into their third trimester, they'll start buying a whole bunch of washcloths, a disproportionate number of washcloths. So if you look at all this data together, and Target has the ability to basically track everything you buy inside its store if you use a loyalty card or a credit card.
Or a coupon.
If you look at all this data together, you can create this picture of what's going on in someone's life and figure out if they're, for instance, pregnant, if they're getting a divorce, if they're moving, if they have a kid who's graduating from college. You can see these patterns by studying shopping habits. And once you have the ability to know what's going on in someone's life, you can tailor your marketing message to take advantage of those habits.
Let me jump in for one quick second, because all of those moments that you talked about, moving, graduation, job change, pregnancy, those are moments when a company can have much greater leverage over changing your buying habits. Otherwise, we're pretty fixed, correct?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. If you think about it, you probably buy the same toothpaste every single time you go to the grocery,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Because you don't care that much about what toothpaste you buy. You don't want to spend any time thinking about it. But we know that when you're going through a major life event, like having a baby or getting a divorce or graduating or moving from one house to another, all of a sudden you start buying different things.
Things are up for grabs.
Yeah, when people get married or divorced, the type of beer that they buy tends to change. But they might not even be aware of that, but marketers are aware of it, and they care a lot.
So with Target, you tell this wonderful story about, because what you run into is a tension there. If you're discovering through your fantastic algorithmic analysis of someone's buying patterns and a million other people's buying patterns that this woman is pregnant, but she hasn't, you have the story of a father that comes in and is angry at the Target.
Right. Yeah, he comes in and he says, my teenage daughter has been getting all these coupons from you guys for things like cribs and bottles and maternity clothes. And, she's still in high school. Are you trying to encourage her to get pregnant? And the manager comes out and he says, I'm sorry, sir. I don't know why she's getting these coupons in the mail. I really apologize. And the manager, this really bothered the manager. So a couple of days later, he called again to apologize to the father one more time. And the father picks up the phone and he says, well, I actually I had a conversation with my daughter, and she's due in August. It turns out I owe you an apology. But that's how powerful this algorithmic analysis of shopping habits can become. You can identify when people are pregnant, even if their parents don't know.
Right, and as you point out, if you suddenly started flooding someone with they're pregnant but they haven't told you, Target, and you start flooding them with baby coupons, they're going to feel like they've been spied on. So they have to have the knowledge they have, but not act like they do.
That's exactly right, and that's what Target found, is that if they start sending them, if they basically say, we know you're pregnant, you never told us, people get kind of spooked out. So what Target did, and what all companies do at this point, is they started camouflaging how much they knew. They would send women coupons for diapers and for onesies, but they would put it next to, for instance, a coupon for a lawnmower or for wine glasses, things that they knew that pregnant women didn't want. And so as a result, the women who got those coupons assumed that they were just kind of random, that they were anonymous, when in truth they had been tailored precisely to appeal to their tastes. They'd been tailored precisely to send them pregnancy coupons, but to hide that Target knew that they were pregnant.
Yeah. We're going to have to bring it to a close. Let me just say two other things. One, in reading this, I thought it was ironic, the name of the company, Target, because they have certainly perfected targeting. And also the fact that they no longer speak with you and you are not allowed on their premises or something because you were putting out too many secrets. Am I correct?
Yeah. They were not pleased.
They were not pleased. Okay. The book is The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and in Business. To learn more, go to charlesduhigg.com. That's Duhigg. You can listen to this week's conversation and many other anytime during the week by linking to the podcast. You can sign up to have it delivered to you weekly. You can do those things at two places, either iTunes or at my site. And there's two names for my site, and they're both the same site, terrencemcnally.net. That's one word, TERRENCEMCNALLY. .net or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. If you want to receive my weekly email announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and 2 or 3 articles about the issues we're going to talk about, email me. You can sign up at my site or email me at T.E. McNally. The playwright got T. McNally. I have T.E. McNally at mac.com. You can also check out Freeform with Terrence McNally on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. This program will be archived for the next 90 days at kpfk.org. You can check audio archives and scroll down by date and time. Thanks to G, my engineer, Stan Mizrahi and Mark Maxwell in production, Matt Perez in traffic, and you, my listeners. I look forward to being with you again next week. And finally, thank you to Charles Duhigg, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Okay, we enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Progressive Voices desperately needs your financial help. Please go to progressivevoices.com and press the donate button right now. Thank you.
Progressive Voices' John Sinton has written a continuing series called A Turning Point that touches on politics, culture, and media. You can hear the short essays in the on-demand section of progressivevoices.com and on the PV app.
CRT is a catch-all for owning the libs. For months, I argued that no K-12 school system anywhere teaches it. My bad for totally missing the marketing genius behind the misapplication of the phrase. They know it isn't taught anywhere this side of grad school, but it makes a great stalking horse. Columnist Thomas Edsel put me right. He said Christopher Rufo, a Manhattan Institute senior fellow and self-identified brawler, takes full credit for turning critical race theory into a political wedge issue.
Go to the on-demand section of progressivevoices.com or the PV app and look for A Turning Point.